Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Vertical Space, a podcast at the intersection of technology and flight. We are your hosts, Jim Barry, Peter Shannon, and Luka Tomjanovic, and here we look at the most important forces shaping the market of advanced air mobility with a particular focus on why and how they matter to those building a business in this very exciting and growing industry.
We believe that if you have the ability to actually ship goods at high speed but low cost, you can switch from a supply chain model to a demand-driven model, where instead of having to orchestrate weeks of bumps along the way to move a good to a certain place, hoping that I would walk into the store today and buy it, that you'd only ship it once I've given you my dollars and clicked buy or walked into that store. So from that point of view, we believe the actual substitution could be a lot higher than people typically anticipate.
So welcome to our conversation with Svilen Rangelov, co-founder and CEO of Dronamics, a business with a goal to change how the world moves goods. We start with a discussion around the broader drone UAS market and then the cargo drone delivery market, including use cases and early demand, challenges and opportunities, and the overall landscape. Svilen mentions that 1% of cargo moves by air, but air cargo represents 35% of the overall value of cargo. We spend most of our time talking about Dronamics, the problems they're solving for customers near and long term with their middle mile solutions. This is a great part of the discussion. Listen to how Svilen believes they'll be providing a better and less expensive solution than today's alternatives, especially with their initial focus on underserved markets. We also discuss his challenges and opportunities and why middle mile versus last mile solutions, where last mile are where many others are focused. We also discuss their vehicle, the Black Swan, and how they plan to be an OEM, an operator, and manager of droneports. Listen to the really interesting requirements and capabilities of droneports, the costs and challenges, and how they believe these droneports are an essential part of their competitive advantage and customer value. Svilen also discusses his conversations with logistics companies and their focus on cost. And what would you guess is the one type of partner they would most like to work with to ensure their long-term success? We also discuss his work with European regulators and the regulatory approvals, including for design verification. Finally, listen to what it will take for Svilen and his co-founder brother Konstantin to both shave their beards, and why it's likely they'll both be clean-shaven by the end of this year. Many thanks to Svilen and Dronamics for a substantial discussion, and to our listeners, enjoy our talk with Svilen as you innovate in the vertical space.
This episode of the Vertical Space podcast is brought to you by UAvionics. UAvionics is the leader in low size, weight, and power certified avionics for manned, unmanned, and advanced air mobility aircraft. Let UAvionics help you achieve your goals, whether that be type certification, airspace access, or beyond visual line of sight operations. UAvionics has certified and certifiable communications, navigation, and surveillance avionics for your aircraft. So head over to uavionics.com or Google it to see how you can start flying safer and move your platform forward into shared airspace.
Svilen Rangelov has an economics degree from Davidson College and worked in consulting before focusing fully on Dronamics, the company he founded with his brother Konstantin in 2014. Svilen is passionate about the socioeconomic impact of fast, affordable, and green freight. Growing up on the fringes of Europe, he experienced firsthand the invisible tax that communities and businesses outside traditional hubs are subjected to. A report by the World Bank, which highlighted that better logistics have a greater effect on trade than tariffs and other similar policies, inspired Svilen to focus fully on developing Dronamics as a business that will change how the world moves goods. Svilen is a frequent speaker at international events and forums on unmanned aerial systems, advanced air mobility, and innovation in logistics. Svilen, welcome to the Vertical Space. Great to have you on.
Great to be here.
And let me ask you our first question. Is there anything that very few in the industry agree with you on?
Well, as a matter of fact, yes. We seem to be the only company that's taking the approach that we have, and that's to not just be an OEM, but also an operator, and do it specifically with a fixed wing, middle mile cargo drone, and not be worried about vertical takeoffs or first and last mile or electrification right off the bat. So we took a very focused approach, and that served us very well.
So what's most controversial about what you're doing that people don't agree with you on? Is it the non-vertical lift? Do people question whether that's viable or not?
Yeah, I think a lot of people automatically assume that verticality is a huge benefit, which it is, and therefore missing that is somehow a disadvantage. But when you look at how things are being moved, you have these huge pipes that are moving things long distance. And for anything long distance, the verticality and being able to land precisely at the foot of the customer is not such a big pain point. And as a matter of fact, the other bit here that I would argue people overseas, just the footprint of all these vertical spaces, that instead of landing at one airfield, you end up landing at 20. That means you still end up having 20 times the footprint, and you still need to have folks who are there to receive the packages, to service the aircraft, to secure it, and so on. So we necessarily realize that actually the bigger pain point is moving things as people trade them, so moving them between the cities over long distances. And that's the area where we wanted to focus. That's not to say there isn't a use case in verticality and that there aren't solutions there. All we're trying to say is that it's really, really hard to fly. You're subject to so many constraints. You're defying gravity, literally. So it's so much better to be focused and really excel at the one job that you need to do, which is to go longer distances. If you start adding long distance and verticality, then you're necessarily going to have a suboptimal solution. And the thing about cargo is, while passengers may be happy to pay a premium for that, cargo is very, very cost obsessed. So for cargo, you really need to use a very focused solution for the very focused problem.
And we're going to talk more specifics about Dronamics in a few minutes, and we're looking forward to that. But when you consider that you're a middle mile solution, I would assume very few would disagree that the fixed wing and the use of the runways isn't the most efficient given the number of runways that are available throughout the world. It's the most efficient, most economical. It's probably the smartest way to go for middle mile. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. There's 50,000 airstrips around the world, and the vast, vast majority of them end up being really underused. So there's already the real estate out there that you can leverage. And that's why a fixed wing solution over long distances is the best fit for a middle mile.
If we zoom out a little bit, Svilen, where are we today in terms of market adoption? What's your assessment of the maturity of the drone industry?
I'm sure we can all agree that it's not where everyone wanted it to be. 10 years ago this year, Jeff Bezos went on 60 Minutes and announced how Amazon will fly packages via small drones. And outside of a handful of suburbs in the US, that has not been the case, right? So we can understand the public's skepticism about drones and how much longer we need to wait for them. At the same time, our business, and precisely because we took this contrarian approach of very narrow focus on the one specific portion of the whole journey that we solved, the middle mile with a fixed wing machine, has meant that we were actually able to obtain the operational certification so that we can start commercial flights later this year. And there is a path. We did it. We're going to start those flights later in the year. And we know that there will be other entrants in the years after. So I think it's been a very long wait, but we're just at the dawn of the industry.
What do you think is holding the industry back, and what do you anticipate as the next big milestone for the industry?
I think just demonstrating that can be done will go a long way. So that's one, overcoming that sort of disillusionment that has been accumulated throughout the years from the public. Then same for the regulators. In Europe, the rules already exist, but in the US, there is a path, but it's a lot more conservative path. And we believe that the whole industry is waiting for a certified detect and avoid solution that will just unlock BVLOS flights in the US. But in a lot of other markets, you could potentially start such flights earlier. So it's a patchwork of adoption challenges around the world, depending on where you are.
Can we linger on this a little bit and double click on this notion of waiting for an approved detect and avoid solution in the US, holding that market back versus no critical need for that to unlock BVLOS in Europe. Do you mind elaborating on this contrast?
Well, I think the regulators themselves should be the best place to weigh in here. From our perspective, we just see a variety of approaches and philosophies, if you may call it that way. Ultimately, it's all about the risk. It's not certain that a certified DAA solution will be the only answer to achieving the necessary safety of flight. So there's other geographies that decide to manage this in the meantime via a different way. For example, we fly only in controlled airspace. We have transponders on board and all kinds of equipment that you can find on a general aviation or aircraft or a business jet. And if folks are willing to accept aircraft operated by humans, and humans are by no means 100% error free, then there's reason to believe that we could accept aircraft that are not necessarily with the same stack of technology everywhere, if that makes sense. In other words, instead of waiting for just that holy grail, the DAA solution, to enter the US, we've chosen to first work in the markets where it's not really a must.
Right. So you're operationally constrained so that you still satisfy the necessary air and ground risk thresholds.
Exactly. The whole SORA methodology that the EU has implemented, and it's the work of JAROS, where even the US was part of formulating it, goes a long way to determine that risk assessment using precisely those calculations about the ground risk, the air risk, and the mitigation factors that you need to implement in order to limit the potential of bad outcomes.
And are the European regulators, and by that I mean the individual national civil aviation authorities, are they comfortable with this idea that you don't necessarily need detect and avoid if you're flying in controlled airspace? Because there's always this risk of aircraft that will not be conspicuous, and you flying into airports that share operations with other manned aircraft. And plus, if you're really marketing the company, I'm not necessarily saying that this is the case for Dronamics, but if a company is marketing more of a rural cargo service, then you can argue that perhaps the airspace around those targeted airfields are not controlled to the level we were just talking about.
That's a very good point, but actually there's a different market that can serve here as guidance, and that's the sort of the military drones, where if such a detect and avoid solution existed there, I'm sure by now it would have trickled down into the commercial market, but it hasn't. And as we know, one of the reasons is, of course, the types of missions being executed with military drones require a lot more human attention and participation. In Malta, there's one airport. And because there's only one airport, it also hosts the two military drones that Malta owns. They've had a lot of opportunity to learn how to integrate drone operations within the same space where they have passenger traffic. There's been missions, over in Libya and so on, all throughout the Mediterranean. So the coexistence of remotely piloted systems with commercial traffic has been a well-trodden path already.
How far do you think we are from BVLOS operations at scale throughout the continental Europe, and what will get us there?
Well, we're working very hard on that to enable that. We'll start commercial flights on a limited basis in the Mediterranean later this year, and then expand in 2024. So continental Europe and flights, majority over land, will take place in later 24 and 2025.
When you look at the drone market broadly, where do you see signs of early demand? What are some of the use cases where we'll see big growth over the next 12 months?
Outside of the middle mile market, I think there will not be too much progress on such a short time frame of 12 months. We see some entrants in the last mile delivery market, like Mana and so on, doing the things that Amazon haven't yet done. But and Wing is also seems to be advancing, and everyone saw the Zipline presentation recently. But the path to scaling such operations is quite complex, and we certainly wish everyone luck, but I would not be surprised if it takes a little bit longer. And that's that's just aviation for you, right? Hardware is hard, and flying hardware is even harder. One of the reasons why we didn't go after the last mile is precisely because of the order of magnitude higher complexity there and the longer certification path. So we focused on the middle mile because we continue to believe that it is going to be the early entrant in drone technology for commerce.
What drives this complexity that you see in other cargo missions, not middle mile?
Very simply put, if your drone is 10 kilograms or 15 kilograms and the regulator tells you that you need to put another 10 kilograms of equipment and sensors and transponders and a parachute and so on, it's extremely hard to take off with doubling your weight. If you put 10 extra kilos of equipment to make the whole system safer on a large aircraft, you won't like it, but you won't have a problem. And that's just the fact that when you scale down, things get infinitely more complex. The other bit, obviously, is the space in which they operate. It's no coincidence that most of these applications are in suburban environments where you would have one address per household, where the built environment is not as complex. But the moment you start hitting the actual real challenge for last mile, which is urban environments, that's going to be extremely difficult to do with a tiny device, and to do it well in all kinds of weather and all kinds of obstacles. So again, for sure it can be done, it will be done, but it will just take more time.
Before we get into kind of the practicality of one market versus another, middle versus last mile, if we step back and we look at the air cargo market overall, where is the greatest river of cash? How does the middle mile compare to the last mile as it relates to the size of the realizable market?
Depending on whose research you follow, the middle mile can be between 30 and 50% of the total journey, and also depending on the definition of what middle mile goes for. So our solution, and the reason why we wanted to have a long range drone and not just serve several hundred kilometers, but actually be able to fly as much as 2,500 kilometers, was so that we can truly have an aircraft that can cover all of Europe or half the continental US. Just be able to concentrate inventory in a single location for almost a full continent, right? So that was the job in formulating the Black Swan. When you look at how supply chains are done today, the middle mile can be a deceiving term that can include both airplanes, trucks. Could shipping be that middle journey? We believe that if you have the ability to actually ship goods at high speed but low cost, you can switch from a supply chain model to a demand-driven model, where instead of having to orchestrate weeks of bumps along the way to move a good to a certain place, hoping that I would walk into the store today and buy it, that you'd only ship it once I've given you my dollars and clicked buy or walked into that store. So from that point of view, we believe the actual substitution could be a lot higher than people typically anticipate.
Now, I will assume there will be people listening right now, Svilen, who may say, well, middle mile drone, is there a market for that? Because they're probably thinking fixed wing can probably do that very effectively. And especially considering with Dronamics, you're a fixed wing aircraft. So, and I know, again, without getting specifics, and I know you generally are targeting the underserved communities initially, but how do you respond to an investor? Or let's say you're in a presentation and somebody says, why is there a need for drones for middle mile? Don't conventional aircraft address that sufficiently?
Well, you would be surprised to learn that the average transit time of air cargo can be as high as a week. So yes, the integrators, the FedEx, recently Amazon, and so on, are sort of the exception. In most of the supply chain, air cargo movement takes a lot more than just the actual flight, and it may rely on, yes, these are much bigger airplanes that already exist, but because they're bigger, they only fly to much bigger airports, which means they don't fly as frequently, and they have to wait for all the cargo to be loaded. Otherwise, no one wants to fly half empty. When you take a smaller aircraft, you have to put the crew on the ground, because the more you scale down, you cannot scale down obviously the cockpit and the humans. So by separating the crew from the aircraft, you're able to create this smaller pixel, this smaller size that you can fill a lot quicker, that you can send to a lot smaller airfield, that can be a lot closer to the customer. So yes, there is definitely a market for that. And we hear that feedback from a lot of the companies that we're speaking to, who are essentially the customers. And we don't sell the aircraft. So our model is to be an operator. So we talk to the actual logistics providers and Fortune 500s who just buy the capacity on our airline the same way that they would buy it on a big airline.
Svilen, tell us a little bit more about this feedback that you're receiving from initial customer. What exactly is the pain point that they feel the most?
So there's a number of verticals that a solution like ours can be relevant. These range from the very time-critical, high-value missions. For example, time-critical spare part delivery. Let's say your production line breaks down, and this happens a lot. Right now, it's tackled with the onboard courier market, where literally you have a courier who receives a text message, picks up a backpack with a spare part, gets on the first flight out, sometimes charters a private jet even on that. And even if it's 50,000 to move that part, the customer doesn't care, because they'll pay a lot more in penalties if the production line doesn't start working ASAP. So that's the more obvious, as well as some pharma, obviously life-saving. We've seen small drones make a lot of progress there, again, because the cost is not priority number one. But we believe that if you do a really good job of formulating the right size of small aircraft that you can mass produce and operate out of these small airfields and so on, that you can actually attack a lot of the markets of the lower value traffic. And I mean by that, any physical good that's retails for $15 or $20, you may want to ship it this way to the end customer instead of going by truck.
All of the use cases that you mentioned, they make a lot of sense. What also comes to mind is that they're not easily predictable. They seem to be chunky. So how do you build a business around the customer pain point itself, around the regulatory environment, around utilizing the available technology that exists today? How do you build a business and steer it in the direction of the cargo movements that allows you to succeed even at these small scales?
That's a very good question. It's one of the other reasons why we start with operations in Greece and the Mediterranean. We would be serving routes which are not currently served, and the next best alternative is to use a ferry, which takes dramatically more time. So obviously, in the beginning, we are supply constrained, so we'll have a very limited number of drones. We fly a very limited number of routes, and yet we still start with scheduled flights that we pre-sell to customers. So logistics companies, as well as Fortune 500s, they're used to buying block space agreements on cargo airlines. So these are essentially forward contracts for a full year or multi-year at a given rate. They lock in the rate, so they're not exposed to seasonality and fluctuations. And the numbers work out because we are able to achieve a price point that's lower than existing aviation. Even though let's say the spare part business is irregular, the saving that they realize is just so much that they're okay with, booking, let's say, the full week and then using it just once a week.
So is this the model that you're adopting as well? And if so, how does that reconcile with the demand-driven approach that you mentioned before?
The demand-driven approach will become possible the moment network effects start kicking in. If you're a merchant, you want to be able to sell not just to one city or one town. And naturally, any operator will have to start with a single city pair. So in the beginning, we have to do what exists so that then we can unlock what doesn't yet exist.
So the initial pain point that you're solving is providing logistics where there's currently no alternative, or providing logistics where the alternative is very costly and the customer prioritizes time over cost.
That's correct. And being able to actually sell that capacity in block space means that, of course, the customer has already purchased it. So they're not going to want to just use one flight of the week. They would want to go and fill those airplanes throughout the other days of the week as well. So that's how a lot of this demand will be uncovered.
So I was interested to think more about the customers that you've been developing relationships with and hearing a little bit more about the insights that you've learned from hearing about their pain points and their vision for how they might adopt your capability as it scales up.
So the very first customer conversation we had back in 2014, the customer themselves said, you know what, I don't want to buy drones because, you know, this is something new. If my truck breaks down, I can fix it in any village. But if there's a maintenance issue, what do I do? Well, we've heard that feedback quite a lot of times, and that's reinforced our operator model. But to specific pain points, one of our customers, for example, needs to ship spare parts throughout continental Europe. And yes, there's the onboard courier with a private jetway, but there's other ways too, depending on the urgency, whether it's for, let's say, for the marine spare parts or automotive or even aerospace for AOGs. So the ground way is to basically have these sprinter vans with team drivers, so 2 drivers. In Europe, you have regulations where you have to rest after 8 or 9 hours of driving, so that you don't have to stop. They just hop on two drivers in the vehicle. And let's say from Hamburg to Barcelona, it would take them as much as 18 to 20 hours, depending on at what time of the day they hit. Some of these highways, they cross major cities, and even if they run around them, they may hit like all the hours of the day, get stuck in traffic and so on. So there's a lot of lack of reliability of that solution. So with us, that would be just a 4-hour journey or 5-hour journey and still achieve the same cost. Continental Europe ground transportation is very, very cheap. So this was something very interesting for us, that yes, it's very cheap if you have a big truck, an 18-wheeler with 20 tons of capacity, but it's very cheap because it's typically pre-booked and this is a regular flow. But for irregular flows, like these sprinter vans, the cost on the ground can approach or be the same as ours, and yet we save time by a factor of 4 easily. And then the other case we're working on is there's a retailer in Greece, and they have a number of locations all throughout the islands. So they have to maintain stock and inventory as people walk in and they buy the products from the shelves. There's obviously, a long tail of goods that are not as often purchased. Do they really need to sit at every single one of those 40, 45 stores? No. As long as they can ship them in a matter of an hour or 2, they can still sell and the customers will be happy. So that kind of centralization of inventory that I spoke about, the network model will unlock. That's going to be quite powerful and I think something people don't really think about often.
There's a lot of entrepreneurs in the audience, and I'm sure they would really appreciate hearing about your experience talking to logistics companies. How easy are those conversations? How challenging has it been for you to prove a business case for that customer? How do they go about estimating their own return on investment? Can you share a bit of best practices or lessons learned from talking and negotiating with this customer segment?
Well, the cargo market is the one we picked for different reasons, but one of the reasons was because it's the most difficult one, right? Almost every vertical in cargo prioritizes cost above anything else, right? So less than 1% of global trade moves by air, and yet 35% of global trade by value moves by air. So 99 times out of 100, shippers just say, please don't put my good on an airplane because it's going to be too expensive and it's not worth it. And the average good on an airplane is 35 times the value of the good that doesn't fly, or the 99% of those goods that don't fly. So being able to communicate that, okay, this is some new technology that will be actually cheaper than existing technology has been very hard because everyone's experience has been the opposite. We had flat screen TVs in the beginning, and they used to cost $10,000 and so on. And they didn't start out costing, $300 like they do now. What we've been working on so hard for all these years is not to create just an unmanned aircraft, but one that is actually cheaper to produce and to operate than the status quo, so that we can be relevant for a market that's as merciless as the cargo one. And from that point of view, the conversations with the customers actually go a little bit in reverse. We know that our job is not done until we've met the cost, and therefore they are very receptive on the business case. The business case is not the challenge. The challenge has been historically, first, we've been pre-product for many years. We started a company 8.5 years ago. We promised not to shave until we're ready with the first flight. But that's, like I said, aviation takes time. And the other bit has been regulations. Thankfully, regulations are becoming more and more sorted now that we have a license to operate, and we'll be starting commercial flights. And also on the product side, we're very close to finally shaving and being able to fly. So the conversations have been getting a lot easier lately. But as advice, what I would say is just start with first principles. What we held to be true in the beginning when we first started the company remains true today. And that's why we've kept our focus and haven't had the need to pivot or to adapt to something, because we continue to see the opportunity and more people see it alongside us.
Boy, one thing I noticed, Svilen, and going back to your material, back 6-7 years ago, speaking of first principles and speaking of how you envision the market, your Black Swan, it's almost the exact same configuration as what you saw 7 years ago, isn't it? As far as capacity, range, speed, and the like, altitude, and the like.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about something. You hear people in advanced air mobility talk about the value and the attractiveness of cargo as a viable space for a lot of reasons. And you've said, okay, I'm going to focus in the middle mile, which is great. And you've done it in a somewhat low risk manner. You don't have batteries, and it's a gas engine, right? It's a traditional aircraft, and I mean, in the sense that it's a fixed wing, it's not vertical lift. But when you consider the middle mile, you think, okay, the alternative can be rather inexpensive with aircraft and the like, but you've said it takes a long time because they run almost like a hub and spoke system, right? Versus yours point to point. And you've mentioned that Greece, for example, and I've read that Greece is one of the first markets you're going into because it's so expensive to move, because it's either ferry or some other means that's really expensive and it takes a really long time. So you said, I'm going to focus on that. But that's a tiny part of the overall market. What are the next market segments that you feel you can next walk into after you're done with Greece? And then what technologies or regulations have to change for you to meet the needs of that market, Svilen?
Scaling is something we think about a lot. Greece comes first, and then the rest of the Mediterranean, and then continental Europe and other markets as well. Some of those we do move into in parallel, because just opening those up takes such a long time, and you have to be really careful how you align them. So one of the interesting things about us is, while we invent the airframe, we do not mass manufacture it. Yes, we have a prototyping facility here in Bulgaria that we build the first unit and we'll build small runs out of. But the idea for this model is also to have them built by manufacturing partners on a regional basis, so that the US factory will serve the US and the one in Australia, and so on and so forth. We already have 2 of those partnerships in place. And so we do have a schedule of when we'll receive the first aircraft and when we'll deploy it in which market. It is a complex endeavor, I agree, but it is the proven one. In many ways, we're trying to be both a Boeing and a Lufthansa under one roof.
So when you're an early pioneer in middle mile logistics and you have to make decisions on business model or decisions on the technical approach or customers to go talk to initially or markets to go serve, there's a lot less reliance on data obviously, because there is not much data in the industry, and you're relying a lot more on intuition, opinion, gut feel. What are some of these assumptions that you had to make based on your gut feel of the market that really stands out in the overall strategy of Dronamics?
Well, we chose focus as the use case, middle mile with fixed wing, but we accepted the fact that we have to marry those two businesses under one roof, the R&D and the operations, because in order to be successful in technology, you have to always keep innovating. So the shorter the feedback loop is between operations and R&D, the better the technology will become and the quicker that improvement will come. So that's why early on we decided to have that operator model as well, even though it goes a little against sort of the general advice that's always been like focus, pick one. We just don't believe that the market is there yet to run a successful strategy as just one, or at least not for our market and where we're at.
What do you think needs to change in the market for this paradigm to change?
Well, to have a lot more examples. So right now, if you stick to just the OEM model, you have to sell to operator A, but then to operator B, operator C. And if you look at aviation, it's the one sector with the most expensive assets, and yet the margins of airlines are traditionally single digits, right? Because the value and how it's created, it's by the time it reaches the airlines, there's just not that much left. A lot of that is in the logistics companies, a lot of that is in the OEMs and service providers, MRO and so on. So we think if you're purely OEM, pretty quickly you will find that there's a mad race to the bottom in terms of costs. And operators have learned that it's very rare to be the winning strategy to rely on just a single type of operation. You know very well you have to use a number of types in order to be successful.
Tell us about the concept of operations and the Black Swan itself. What does the typical mission look like?
Because we have this operator model, we realized we have to sort not just the drone, but also the other type of equipment that we need to deploy. We focus on three key pillars. One is the drone, the other is the drone port, and the third part is the network operations center. So when it comes to a particular country, let's say Greece, there will be a drone port at every location. The deployment of a drone port is not the runway. The runway already exists. And we can also land at unpaved and very short runway. So any airstrip, dirt strip should work. What we do need there is a minimum set of equipment and a couple of pilots. And those pilots need to be initially commercially trained pilots with a lot of experience in manned aviation. And besides the two pilots, we also need a couple of ground handlers and a mechanic. So that minimum crew needs to be at every location. Again, we are focusing on connecting city to city, town to town, and so on. So we anticipate that there will be daily need to service that location. And that's why that kind of footprint makes sense and doesn't break the model. In fact, even with this, we're still able to achieve very attractive unit economics. So but going back to the country, so at every location where we take off or land from, there will be our team, our employees and our equipment. So our ground station, our drone port, and then at a single location for the whole country. In Europe's case, for the whole of EU, we'll also have a network operations center. And that's sort of the central location where we oversee all the flights, all the drone ports, the whole fleet, and we can react and adapt and take over during flight if there's an issue.
What about the route itself? Can you give us a bit more detail on the technologies that are inside the Black Swan and how command and control is done, how you're thinking about solving detect and avoid, any other technology insights?
Sure. So our core IP is on the airframe and the integration of the avionics systems. We are definitely happy to integrate any DAA solution that is on the market that's certified, encouraged by the regulators and so on. In the initial operations, the way we would operate would be to start flying from commercial airports with that commercial pilot team that I mentioned. So the two pilots at the origin will take care of the initial flight plan filing with the local authorities and the taxiing to the runway and the takeoff. Then the two pilots at the destination will take care of the landing as well as the taxiing to the part of the apron where the loading and unloading is being done. And then they will taxi back to the runway and do the takeoff for the journey back or for the journey forward. In the midsection, in the cruise flight, via satellites, we'll be able to monitor and control and intervene from the network operation center into the flight. That's the concept of operations that very much mimics existing aviation, with the only key difference being that instead of one cockpit with two pilots in the actual airframe, we have three different teams of commercially trained pilots for the three different sections of the journey of the flight. And in terms of the avionics stack, again, we have autopilot, we have a number of radio and SATCOM links, different contingency planning. We fly in controlled airspace. With the Rotax engine, we can go up to 22,000 feet, so we have quite a lot of space in which to operate. Of course, these routes are in advance predetermined by the authorities, and this is where that middle mile business case helps, because you're talking about the same route that will be executed day in, day out on a given city pair.
And are those routes IFR routes or VFR routes? How different are those from the existing traffic?
IFR, yeah.
So they're on published existing IFR routes?
If the city pair is currently served by aviation, yeah. So it will be just a controlled airspace flight.
And the crew that manages and oversees the operation in the route segment, do they sit in the network operations center?
That's correct.
And what is the ratio of aircraft to operator that you target or that you have approval for?
Well, we're targeting between 1 to 10 and 1 to 15. There's a lot of research that shows that this can be safely done, even from where before we started. We would look to increase that ratio with operations and with more proof as well.
What drives the need to have two operators on each end of the mission instead of just one?
Well, we wanted to replicate the existing aviation model as much as possible. So there are reasons why there's two people up there in a cockpit, and the same risks that we're mitigating in a cockpit, we're using two pilots on the ground as well.
But Svilen, you're not saying that those pilots need to be at the drone port, geographically at the drone port, are you? They can be somewhere remote in the network operations center, can they not?
Eventually, possibly, yeah, and maybe that's where we'll get to. But initially, yes, they will have to be at the drone port.
Svilen, if we think about the day-to-day job of these pilots, if you take a commercial instrument-rated pilot, what type of training would you need to give them, and how would their actual role in operating the aircraft, whether they're at the point of origin or destination, or whether they're one of the en route operators, how does it differ from what they would be doing in the cockpit today? And what type of training would you give them to bridge that?
This is difficult to answer because we're still evolving that ourselves. We're developing that curriculum with our partners from Flight Safety International, but our current pilot team consists of CPL and ATPL rated pilots with many thousands of hours of experience. And that's really what we want. Initially, it costs so much to become a pilot, and there's definitely such passion into choosing that as a profession that the best audience for not flying with the vehicle are, in fact, retiring or retired pilots, or pilots who want to not travel as much anymore. So we are relying on all the skills that they've learned and been able to practice in their commercial aviation days, and through a program that we're developing, that they'll be able to operate safely on our systems as well.
Okay, so let's take the en route pilot as an example, where in your ConOps, this pilot is going to be managing not one aircraft, but as you said, 10 or potentially 15. How does their workload change, and what are your systems going to do to support them in that as they're not operating one aircraft, but they're supervising many? How does that user interface for them look, and what does their workload look like?
I think the en route pilots would be actually a lot more cross between a commercial pilot and an air traffic controller, because there will be a little bit of both. Whereas the workload for the drone port pilots will be a lot more similar to the workload in an actual machine. In terms of the en route pilots, they should be assisted by as much as possible by our technology, and that is helped by the fact that we are operating cargo, and cargo is much simpler than other missions. So unlike, let's say, a military surveillance, any kind of inspection scenario, you know how the flight should happen even before you've started it. The goods have to get to the destination. And so the attention of that en route pilot should be taken by the exceptions rather than the actual flight. So where we want to get to is a highly automated flight that only the most complex decisions, if there are any to be made, are made by humans in that network ops center.
Given your choice of having two operators at takeoff and landing points, how do you then handle contingency situations or situations in which you need to divert to another airport where you don't have the ground team in place?
Yeah, so we manage this both through equipment on the aircraft. So we still have the capability to auto land, and the en route pilots who are sitting at the network ops center. So a route as simple as it should be for cargo scenario still includes a number of contingency scenarios and backup airstrips and locations if things go wrong. That should be pre-approved by the regulators as well, the same way that in regular aviation it's being done.
So the airports that you can land at, they need to have an approved instrument approach procedure?
Well, yes.
And so do the target airports in rural areas that you're serving, do they typically have instrument approach procedures?
No, not a lot, but we are also working with regulators in the particular countries to be able to create those procedures, or to be able to, in the case of emergency, not use the instrument approach. Again, if you have just a handful of airports in, let's say, in European countries, there's typically 2 or 3 airports that get any traffic, and everything else is very, very sporadic. Most of those runways are free and unoccupied throughout almost 24 hours. So in case of an emergency, whether or not there is an IFR approach or not should become secondary to actually managing the emergency and landing there if need be.
I see. And what is the highest sale level within your mission that you currently have approval for?
We're now starting with Sale 2. We're working on design verification process that will unlock Sale 3 and 4. And then we're also going to be applying for higher sale levels as well. When we started the design of the aircraft many years ago, we did not anticipate the SOAR framework or that particular approach. So we always designed thinking that we will have to get type certified. And so the plan remains for us to obtain type certification and be able to fly anywhere. It's just that because of our low risk approach, we were able to obtain approval sooner and be able to commercialize sooner. That's been really the unlock here.
What's your experience been so far working with the European regulator on design verification and ultimately type certification? I don't know how advanced you are in these discussions, but what advice would you offer for people who are trying to go down that path of design verification?
Look, it's early days, and the burden is always on the applicant, right? So the more that you can demonstrate, the better or the quicker it will be. So it is a process that we expect will take quite some time. So yeah, just approach it seriously. The earlier you start, the better. That's the best advice anyone has ever given us.
And are there many differences on an individual country level? Obviously, there's the overarching EASA regulations, but there are still differences in how individual civil aviation authorities approach and how forward-leaning they are. What are some of the key insights as you worked with different countries?
For design verification, the application is straight at EASA level. For the type certification process, if a DOA is, let's say, the first step, then yes, it does matter where the country is, but it's not like you can pick it. You have to be where you are anyway. So there's not that much of arbitrage that can be done or should be done. In our case, we're applying for a DOA in the UK because that's where the senior engineers are and that's where our top company is. So it is what it is. That's where we apply. But for DV, we do apply to EASA directly.
So in addition to design verification, what are some of the other approvals that you need in order to start commercial operations?
We can start commercial operations with a design verification. We can start commercial operations for sale 3 and 4, but with our light UAS operator certificate that we have already, we can start operations in sale 2 as well.
I think one of the reasons that a lot of people are going to listen to this podcast is you have a very novel approach to a cool market opportunity. And clearly cargo with advanced air mobility is getting a lot of attention, right? As you speak to investors, is it more difficult to convince them of the middle market drone opportunity or your model of success? Which one do they drill into more where they want more information, and which one is a little bit easier for them to get and a little bit easier for them to understand and feel is viable?
I would say both take the same time to grasp because both are sort of so unusual. Almost everyone is trying to just be an OEM or just an operator.
Right.
And almost everyone is focusing not on the middle mile, but on last mile.
And last mile. All right. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions related to 3 things. So this is unusual. You're an OEM, you're an operator, and you're operating drone ports, right? Or you will operate these drone ports. Of the 3, what's most novel?
I think the drone port network is something that very few people are working on or thinking about.
Why was that so important to do rather than using this existing, I'll use the word infrastructure?
Well, we do use existing infrastructure, but there's still quite a bit that needs to get done to make it right. The equipment that you need to place, the working around, are there other users of that airport? What times, what slots, and so on? What are the economics of using that? And even more so on the customer point of view, where is it located? How far is that? Does that shorten my journey? A lot of these big air cargo used airports are too far out of town. Just getting out of the airport can take several hours from the trucks. So everything matters. So it is something that's, we believe, sometimes overlooked, precisely because people start thinking, well, if I'm not going to be at the big airport, I may as well be vertical takeoff and landing at the foot of the customer. I think there's a lot of space between those 2 extremes, and that's what very few people are looking at.
So OEM, operator, drone port, which one is the hardest of the 3?
We've been focusing over the past 8+ years on the OEM parts. Operations is something we've been working on for several years as we were building out the team there. So I would say we're towards the point where there's very few unknowns in the OEM part, but there's still a lot that we need to uncover in operations.
And what IP do you have on the Black Swan or whatever vehicle may come from that? What IP do you have to prevent others from doing the same?
This is a very interesting question because you don't have fake Cessnas, right? And you don't necessarily have a Cessna protected in the same sophisticated ways, the way that you may protect a Coca-Cola bottle. There's a lot of protection in aviation that comes from just being certified and the only recognized producer or user of a certain thing. I think it will be a mistake for people to just rely on, I'm just going to patent this and no one else can do it, because we also see a decoupling going on from the old globalistic world, where let's just say that patents aren't uniformly respected around the world. So we look at the IP as just one of the pieces of the protection that we need to rely on, but the true defense of that will be the operation and having that network and serving those customers around the world.
To scale effectively around the world, if you could choose one type of partner, what would it be?
An e-commerce company.
Why?
Well, because they've had to reinvent a lot of things. They've had to do a lot of things that everyone was telling them were wrong or crazy or took too long and so on. But also because they ultimately have the direct connection with customers and demand. So they're not afraid to rewrite their supply chains.
Svilen, if you consider I'm going to call it the advanced air mobility air cargo market, what does the next 5 to 10 years look like?
We definitely, in 5 to 10 years, we'll definitely see even urban air mobility take shape, and folks will be flying on UAM vehicles themselves. For the cargo market, it will be a lot earlier than this, and we're going to play a leading role in that, we hope.
So other than patience, what advice would you give to somebody who's starting a business in advanced air mobility?
We're very impatient, actually. It took us a long time because very few people, saw what we saw, and it took a lot of activation energy to be able to prove that what we were seeing was correct. And there's still a lot more to go. I would say persistence and impatience is very important. We didn't pivot because we would be violating the first principle. So the advice is start from first principles, and if the market is still there, if the opportunities and the trends that are enabling that market are still there, it doesn't matter that it will take you longer. Don't quit. I think in a lot of startups, there's this mentality of, well, quit and just try something else and so on. Sure, if you're not the right person for the problem, definitely do that. But if it's the right problem and you see it and foundations remain as strong, eventually others will see that too, and you should be successful.
And when it comes to drone logistics in general, what do you think is the most common misconception?
Well, a very common misconception we hear is that it will work first in emerging markets. Yes, to an effect, Zipline have made it work in Rwanda and Ghana and so on, but we think that's not always going to be the case. Emerging markets are not all alike. Africa is not a country, and so on and so forth. So the misconceptions are that once you may prove it in a place with, let's say, a less sophisticated regulator, that this will somehow give you an edge. I would say regulators would not give you as much credit because they would still want to make sure that the only credit they give you is from peer regulators. I think the other misconception is that it will work really well in urban areas. I think it will take a very long time until that, because so much of people in big cities, they live in these huge multi-story buildings. Would you open the window to let a drone in to give you a package? There has to be quite a lot of infrastructure built, and it will still not be as seamless as if you just have a single house and a yard. But just a tiny fraction of the population around the world has that luxury.
So Svilen, when are you going to shave your beard? Tell our audience about your promise. You and your brother, I assume, are shaving at the same time.
Yeah, so when we received our first investment in 2014, my brother, he's an aerospace engineer, he's my co-founder. So he had the idea to stop shaving until the maiden flight of the aircraft. So it's been 8.5 years. We have had those beards. Luckily, this is not a video interview, but yeah.
Are you shaving this year?
Yeah, we have to shave this year.
Okay. And I have to ask, are you guys married?
Right. All right.
We are.
So,
well, we have a saying, optimize for your fans. So we did get married to wonderful ladies who actually like beards. So yeah.
Wonderful. See how
so
things in life just work out sometimes.
Yeah.
All right. What are you going to do when you become a high volume, profitable organization? Then what are you going to do?
We will figure out the next challenge to stop shaving for.
That's great. All right. You wanted to leave one thought with our audience. Boy, we've talked about a lot. You want to leave one thought with our audience. What would you like to tell them?
Look, when we started, you could have drawn a Venn diagram of customers, suppliers, talent, and investment. In Bulgaria, where we decided to start it with, wouldn't have touched any of these circles. So it doesn't really matter where you start. If we were able to do that in a country that for 70 years hasn't built mass-produced aircraft, then there's very few things in life that should be impossible. So definitely the future is one of capitalizing a lot more on the third dimension that's been so little used right now. And we really want to play a leading role in that. We encourage everyone to get in touch and help us achieve that ambitious mission.
Very cool market, very cool company. We like to refer to the third dimension as the vertical space, by the way. So,
thank you very much, Svilen. This was a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate you going deep and sharing your insights, and we wish you the best of luck. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you guys. It was a pleasure.
All right, that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to the Vertical Space Podcast. Reach out if there are topics that you would like us to discuss, and goodbye until the next episode. Unless mentioned, this podcast is in no way endorsing or promoting any person and or company mentioned, and all opinions within the podcast are solely that of the presenters. The Vertical Space makes no guarantees, warranty, or representation of any information given in this podcast. Any information given is for informational purposes and should be used at your own risk. This podcast is for general, educational, and entertainment purposes only.